Welcome to Who Dares Rolls TV. I'm Charlie Etheridge Nunn, the RPG correspondent for Who Dares Rolls, and Mike B recently released a video of his top 10 Grail games, board games he couldn't find or were long out of print, and that kind of wish list of games that you want but just can't get hold of. And it got me thinking about the RPG equivalent, and it's a little more difficult because so many RPGs are able to be bought on PDF. They're living a good new life on places like DriveThru RPG for things like ancient D&D supplements, ancient Call of Cthulhu supplements. But even so, there are a few rarities out there. Previously, I had a long quest trying to find a copy of Final Girl, for example, which was on PDF briefly, but being a small indie RPG, the author actually pulled it from their website, saying it's too much effort to maintain, to have up on here, so just getting rid of it, sorry. And after the demand for the game from people, he eventually put it up on DriveThru, which was fantastic, but not every game has that kind of resurrection, and not every game is big enough like your D&Ds or anything to have people lovingly going through the back catalogue to bring back. And some games you just want a nice hard copy of. So rather than doing a top 10, I've only got enough for a top 5 here, but I'd be interested to see what games other people have on their Grail games for RPGs. Now, my other caveats are I don't really do D&D anymore. I don't really do any of the World of Darkness stuff, and I could have easily had top 10s back when I was collecting everything I could for both of those games. So you're not going to see any of those. In fact, I'm going to start off with the biggest, I guess, out of all of these different systems. So, without further ado, number 1 is Call of Cthulhu, A Green and Pleasant Land. Now, I mentioned Call of Cthulhu has been seeing reprints of some of their work, primarily in PDF, but this is one that hasn't appeared yet. It's one I've seen occasionally at cons, and over time I've realised this is very much my jam. This is very much the tone and theme that I want to play with Call of Cthulhu. Green and Pleasant Land's a source book covering England between wars. So it's actually covering the default time period of Call of Cthulhu, but over here. And that'd be fascinating to see. I could imagine some really interesting scenarios dealing with survivors of the Great War and the kind of attempts at reclaiming the world and the land that came before all of that, before the kind of massive shock to the culture and the system that happened because of it. So while I do have the Ramsey Campbell's Ghostwood book, and I've occasionally eyed up the Cthulhu by Gaslight, but it's this kind of thing where you've got your Morris men, your village fates, and then weird unspeakable cults. Kind of, I don't know. In my mind, I'm imagining almost Hot Fuzz meets Call of Cthulhu. So I'd be really interested to see that, and hopefully when conventions can happen again and when I can go along to one, it's definitely something that's on my shopping list when I go to any bring and buys. Next up, we're still in the land of Call of Cthulhu, and this one is the Horror on the Orient Express. There were a few different long campaigns for the Call of Cthulhu, role-playing game. There's Masks of Nyarlathotep, which is the big famous one. There's Beyond the Mountains of Madness, which is a sequel to Lovecraft's longest story, which is the only one of these that I actually own. And then there's Horror on the Orient Express, an adventure which is literally on rails, as the group travel the route of the Orient Express with big, hard plot points and side quests and a kind of big overall story that they're piecing together, kind of literally in the case of some of the items that they're acquiring. Now, my reason for this, as well as loving that juxtaposition between the calm, sedate, nice kind of, hamming it up and playing at 20s, but less problematic, and then, oh my god, where's my face? Monsters everywhere, is because of Yogg-Sothoth.com's actual play of Horror on the Orient Express. And I don't actually do much consumption of actual plays. I've tried with some, and there are a few which are really nice and short, and that's kind of how I like to digest the actual play RPG content. I'll listen to maybe an episode of something that's a bit longer, or a series if they're in short chunks, but I just can't get round to doing those like 4 or 5 hour APs. But when I was first listening to podcasts, these guys were what I started with. Originally for a Houses for Blooded AP that they were doing, because nowhere did any of those. And I really liked the tone of the performers. They were all really, really gentle, really friendly, really nice. And it had a familial tone behind the table as well as on the table. And with Horror on the Orient Express, it was everything that I wanted a Call of Cthulhu game to be. And I'm someone who first experienced horror RPGs properly through Call of Cthulhu. So even though I feel I'm a little beyond the system, I'd much rather use something like Cthulhu Dark or Squamous. I've still got a lot of love for the original game and the original system, and these two books, well, this book and this box set with Green and Pleasant Land and Horror on the Orient Express could easily be mined for material for any other games, or just flipped over into something like Squamous, especially for a longer game like Horror on the Orient Express. I could see working really nicely with that. Might have to add a few character classes, which is one of the things that I want to do in order to make Squamous a bit more compatible with Call of Cthulhu, especially with the kind of character classes my group would be. But it's definitely something I'd be interested in. Now, the box set, the original one, is pricey, massive, kind of obelisk, and there is a more recent version, which, because Chaosium have been doing a lot more fancier books, means it's still incredibly pricey, and they've done separate additional things with props, actually using the Yogg-Sothoth.com guys, if I remember correctly. And while the props wouldn't necessarily be essential to it, would be kind of cool to see. So this is one of those RPGs that I kind of want almost a little more, just because of that memory of that campaign and those stories, as well as actually wanting to run it. So, my next one, despite being a top 5, this is 2 RPGs that I'm combining into one entry because they're both very similar, they're both inaccessible for the same reason, and they're even by the same company. These are Marvel Heroic Role-Playing and Smallville. These are both by Margaret Weis Productions, and it's a case where they're both victims of licensing. Ultimately, you can tell they're licensed games, and unfortunately this happens a lot. Now, the Cortex system is the in-house one that was made initially by Margaret Weis Productions. It's now moved over to its own entity. It's got its own core book. It's got some concept going on with a website and online resources and all of that. And it's even being used for a lot of different actual plays, things like Into the Motherlands. So it's got a good pedigree now, but it wasn't always as good, really, or as interesting looking. So originally these systems made were things like Battlestar Galactica, Supernatural, Leverage, and so on. And the first ones that were released, things like Firefly, BSG, Supernatural, all felt like here's a fairly standard trad system, and where's the integration of the themes and the tones of the subject matter into the mechanics? And there wasn't. It was just like any other kind of trad licensed RPG where you go, well, it's just stuff. Here you go. It's a system. These two, Smallville and Marvel Heroic, were kind of where it felt like it diverged in a huge way. And they even created a toolbox kind of book for it afterwards, going, oh, you like this being hacked apart. You want to replicate this kind of experience. And I have it, but really these two games are ones where I would love to see the actual originating forms of these systems. So Smallville is based on the WB, later CW TV show, and normally that shit's my jam. That those terrible teen dramas like your Vampire Diaries and your Riverdales, or is it Riversdale? But yes, Smallville, despite being that, and despite being about Superman, who I love, really, I bounced off a TV show each time I tried to get into it. So it's not because I'm such a fan of the show that I want this game, but it's because it did some really interesting sounding things. It tied characters together, and you created like a mind map of player characters, of supporting characters, and those supporting characters actually had mechanical effects. Similarly, instead of having ability scores like strength, dexterity, constitution, whatever, you had your beliefs, your values. So if you put one of your highest dice into truth, then you would be most effective when you are seeking truth above everything else. And this way you could have someone like Clark Kent, who had, in Smallville, not quite Superman powers, but close, in the same field and balanced equally with Lois Lane, with Oliver Queen, with Lex Luthor, because you could have people playing antagonists in it as well. So it created a real writer's room kind of feeling. And I love that shit. So that's one that I'd be really interested in finding an actual copy of. And Marvel Heroic Role-Playing, which Marvel's had a fraught experience with RPGs. There's the old TSR Phase Rip one, which I got into RPGs way too late for. It looks on a cursory glance fairly impenetrable, and mostly enjoyed because of the random selection of powers. The System Mastery podcast, which is an amazing podcast, covered it in a very recent episode. So if you want to know anything about it, go there. TSR stuck with Marvel's license for a little bit and created a card-based version using the Saga engine, which was alright and almost made this list because I got rid of it some time ago. And then Marvel, as far as I'm aware, took it back in-house. I'm not even sure who they got to design their Marvel superhero role-playing game at that point, but it used kind of tokens and beads and resource allocation, and it was fun to make a character for, but it was a bit shit. Finally, Margaret Weiss Productions made Marvel Heroic Role-Playing, and even though there wasn't a character generation system, that was fine. the characters were built with really interesting XP triggers, something a little similar to what you now see in games like Spire, with characters' callings, where it says, sacrifice yourself and take an amount of damage for an advancement. So that was neat. All of the powers were also different dice types, and all of the skills. Everything was a case of gather up a bunch of dice, roll them, you got your success, you got your effect, and any ones go to me, the GM, for the pool of doom. And it felt a little lighter and more indie-ish than the previous versions of Cortex's system. It introduced some really cool stuff, and it was out for under a year. There was a Civil War book, and the core book itself actually had the introduction to Bendis's New Avengers, which I have down there somewhere. And despite some dated elements of dialogue and general American war on terroriness here and there, is good. Like, I'm a sucker for Bendis's dialogue, personally, so I'm an easy mark. But I had this whole brainstorm of, yes, it would be great to do a kind of the Nail sort of storyline with some players and go, those Avengers, the new Avengers, weren't available in this universe. So we are going to play through this first story arc, but you're not Iron Man, Cap, Luke Cage, Spider-Man, Wolverine, and so on. Pick anyone else from the 616, ideally that's already statted up in the book, and we will start the New Avengers era from there, and then see how it spins out. Will Civil War be the same? Will Secret Invasion be the same? Just because of the choices made and the characters picked. And it was a cool idea, and then I found out it was out of print and inaccessible and ludicrously expensive on eBay. So, alas, that's one that you can't get, not even on PDF. So, that's sad. Again, I'll be keeping an eye out for a copy, but it's not one I'm expecting to be able to get anytime soon. The next one is one I totally understand why I can't get a physical copy of, and I'm mostly fine with that. It's Dogs in the Vineyard. Now, this is one of the early Forge era indie RPGs, and the Forge was a kind of movement of indie design which created games like Burning Wheel, My Life with Master, and in this case Dogs in the Vineyard. It was kind of the protoplasm a lot of a more modern indie game movement came from or mutated from, and of course a million other things have been added since, and there are a lot of people going, it sucked actually, and a lot of people going, oh, if only it was back, and it's probably fine it's gone. It was formative, but so was D&D, and we've moved on from a lot of those kind of things as well, so fine. The only reason I want a physical version of this is for that artifact quality. Now, I have a PDF copy, I think, either from Lumpley Games site ages ago or from a bundle of holding. I forget, when I first got into indie games, I was just buying everything I could find. And Dogs in the Vineyard is a role-playing game set in an alternate Wild West. It's about kind of weird gunslinger, monk, Mormon type characters as they travel from town to town, carrying out religious rites, funerals, weddings, anything like that, and then also acting as kind of witch hunter type characters. And the thing about that is you have some interesting conflict, and I think I may have read more conflict and more strife and difficulty into it than possibly the authors, really. Or maybe it's there but not critical enough of Old West Mormons or the kind of people that are being reflected. Personally, I liked the idea of going, okay, you're going to start this way, but you are going to question it. You're going to realise that finding out why people are guilty instead of if they're guilty, that's an interesting conflict. It's something I was kind of hoping for when I did a Dark Heresy campaign as a player, and my own expectations tanked my feeling for the game ultimately, so I kind of wrecked it for myself a bit. But it was that kind of a thing, that kind of level of complexity that I'd originally wanted, rather than, well, they look evil, so let's nuke the planet. Dogs in the Vineyard is out of print and will remain out of print because the author, Vincent Baker, doesn't really care for the depictions and the potential glorification or lionization of Old West Mormon kind of religious zealot types, and that's completely understandable. This is the kind of book where if I found a cheap copy, it'd be nice just for my shelf to go with Burning Wheel, to go with My Life with Master, for the kind of historical side of my shelves. But if it's not available, I'm less fussed than the other games here. And finally, now I know a lot of people were probably going to expect something like the last Unicorn Games Dune RPG, because that is most people's Grail game. It's something which is incredibly rare, incredibly difficult to find. It was in print for even less time than Marvel Heroic, and that was in print for about as long as this video, frankly. I loved the last Unicorn Games Star Trek RPG, and when I saw that Dune was going to be a game using the same system, I did try and get it, and it was already gone. Personally, and this is a confession which you'll have either seen mentioned in a previous video or in an upcoming video, but I've only read book 3 of Dune because it's all we had on my dad's bookshelf out of the Dune series. I've seen the David Lynch film a couple of times. I am a heathen, I know, but I'm not invested enough in Dune to hunt it down. One day I will read it, otherwise my partner will probably knife me. But until that time, I don't know what I'm missing, so I'm fine skipping past it. Instead, my number 5 is the Legend of the Five Rings 5th edition core rulebook. This is less a licensing issue than a just Fantasy Flight pulling their finger out and reprinting their own damn game's core rulebook. Now, I was a massive L5R fan back in the day. I got into it through the first edition of the RPG, which I bought on a whim. And then I found out there was a CCG. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And I'd been falling out of love with Magic, so seeing a game where there were factions and different groups, different clans, that was cool. And all of those events that happened, so you'd get an expansion, there were stories, things actually happened to progress, characters died, and then there were tournaments, and tournaments led to characters dying or factions winning or losing or getting exiled or all sorts of things, and that was fascinating. But as a game made primarily by white American men about Asian mythology, it does have a few cringeworthy elements. It does have a few problematic elements. There is, of course, honor above everything, all of that. There's been a brilliant series of videos by Asians Represent going chapter by chapter through this exact book, saying what works, what doesn't, what good aspects there are, what there isn't. I know that on staff there are more Asian people, primarily for artwork, but it sounds like Fantasy Flight actually tried to reboot the universe for their living card game version of L5R, which got me right back into the habit. briefly, and then I realised, oh yeah, I'm bad at competitive games, and this is a very much competitive 2-player game, so I just held off. And then the itch came back, and I started listening to Garbage for 5 Rings, a podcast mostly mocking L5R's weird history, especially the collaborative elements where the audience demanded or changed elements of the storyline, and a lot of the presumptions and ideas in the original continuity. I also got listening to the audio version of the Fantasy Flight universe fiction called The Table Is Yours, and was like, oh, this is good. There's some interesting changes, some really cool stuff going on with it. And upon hearing the LCG was ending, I kind of started buying up any of the packs that I didn't get, because it introduces a co-op mode, an asymmetrical mode, and if the last expansion is doing that, that kind of makes the game feel way more playable for me. Of like, ooh, okay, we can all sit around the table, have a co-op experience against the Shadowlands. So the role-playing game, I've bought, I think, everything for 1st edition, everything for 2nd and 3rd, and bits of 4th edition. I'd kind of drifted away from it, between that sense of going, is this problematic? And I mean, the answer is yeah, like a lot of things, but there are still some good things to be mined from it, and it's still a cool universe to play in. So I drifted away, and I heard some amazing things in Dragonmeet from Lloyd Jan about the Fantasy Flight edition. He was saying, oh yeah, it's got the basis of your Star Wars Age of Rebellion and not Scum and Villainy, but all of that kind of Fantasy Flight funny dice Star Wars game, but it looks like they've introduced some fun story game elements. So I checked out the beginner set, and it was kind of cool. And then I watched the Asians Represent series and started jotting down things, plot elements, ideas, modifications that they'd mentioned, and that was really cool as well. So I went to find a copy of the core rulebook, and nowhere has it. Fantasy Flight have now outsourced this, the role-playing side, out to another organisation, another subsidiary of Asmodee, some other group, and they are making new RPG content, but they still haven't reprinted the core rulebook, so it is going for silly money. So it's probably the most likely one that I'll be able to get eventually. But Fantasy Flight haven't done it. This new company haven't done their reprint. So yeah, for now, it remains one of my Grail games. So that's it for me for my selection of 5-ish Grail games that I'm looking out for. Which RPG books or box sets or accoutrement are you hunting down? What Grail games do you have? Comment in the comments, because where else will you do it? Like the video if you like this. Tell me if you've got any leads on any of these books as well. And of course, you can show your support to Who Dares Rolls by going to our Patreon. I'm only sounding halfway tolerable here because of the Patreon, meaning that I'm now wired up rather than using a Rock Band mic. I am dependent on the sunlight or on a spooky lamp for my videos, so who knows, maybe if we get enough patrons I can actually have a decent lighting situation. That's it from me. I've got a couple of text bits going up to the site soon, and I'm sure Mike will have some fascinating board game news for you soon as well. Goodbye.